Good day. Today we'll be reading from A People's Tragedy, A History of the Russian Revolution by Orlando Figes. And we'll be reading a small part about the Octoberists and the Black Hundreds. Among the other liberal groups to emerge at the time, the most important was the Octoberist Party. It took its name from the October Manifesto of 1905, which saw it as the basis for an era of compromise and cooperation between the government, public forces, and the creation of a new legal order. It attracted some 20,000 members, most of them landowners, businessmen, and officials of some sort or another, who favored moderate political reforms, but opposed universal suffrage as a challenge to the monarchy, and not to mention their own positions in the central and local government. If the cadets were liberal radicals, in a sense they kept at least one foot in the democratic opposition, the Octoberists were conservative liberals in the sense that they were prepared to work for reform, only within the existing order and only in order to strengthen it. Lvov himself might have been tempted to join the Octoberists, for D.N. Shipoff, his old political mentor and friend from National Zemstvo movement, was one of the party's principal founders, while Alexander Gorbachev, comrades in arms from the relief campaign in Manchuria, became its leader. But the bitter reform struggle of the previous 10 years had taught him not to trust so blindly in the willingness of the Tsar to deliver promises he had made in his manifesto. The prince preferred to remain with the cadets in a stance of skepticism and half opposition to the government, rather than join the Octoberists in a declaration of loyal support. This was in truth the main dilemma that the liberals faced of the October Manifesto, whether to support or oppose the government. So far the revolution had been a broad assault by the whole nation united against autocracy. But now the manifesto held out the prospect of a new constitutional order in which both monarchy and society might just develop along European lines. The situation was delicately balanced. There was no danger that the Tsar might venge on his constitutional promises or that the masses might become impatient with the gradual processes of political reform and look instead to a violent social revolution. Much would depend on the role of the liberals, who had far led the opposition movement and who were now strategically placed between the rulers and the ruled. Their task was bound to be difficult, for they had to appear both moderate as to not alarm the former and at the same time radical as not to alienate the latter. Witt, who was charged with forming the first cabinet in October, officially offered the several portfolios to the liberals. Shipoff was offered the Ministry of Agriculture, Gorbachev the Ministry of Trade and Industry. The liberal jurist A.F. Coney was selected for the Ministry of Justice and E.N. Trubetsky for education. Prince Urosov, whom we encountered as the governor of Belarusiabi, who sympathized with the cadets, was considered for the all-important post of Minister of the Interior. Two other cadets, Milkonov and Lvov, were also offered ministerial posts, but not one of the public men agreed to join Witt's government, to which had made up of Tsarist bureaucrats and appointees lacking public confidence. It is commonplace by their refusal to join Witt's cabinet, the liberals threw away the best chance to steer the Tsarist regime towards constitutional reform. But this is unfair. The unsettlable reason for the breakdown of negotiation was the liberals' refusal to work with P.N. Durovno, a man known of rightist views and a scandalous past, who had seemed been promised the Minister of Interior, and who is now suddenly offered it in a preference to Urosov. But the cadets were doubtful that Witt would be able to deliver the promises of the October Manifesto in view of the Tsar's hostility to reform. They were afraid of compromising themselves by joining a government that might be powerless against the autocracy. Their fears were partially conditioned by their own habitual mistrust of government and their neutral prediction towards opposition. No enemies on the left that had been the rallying cry during the struggles of 1904-05, and the triumph of October had only confirmed their commitment to the policy of mass agitation from below. Their doubts were hardly groundless. Witt himself had expressed the fear that the court might be using him as a temporary expedient, and this had come in his conversations with the cadets. On one occasion, Milkoff had asked him point blank why would he not commit himself to a constitution. Witt had been forced to admit that he could not because the Tsar does not wish it, since the Premier could not guarantee the manifesto would be carried out, or it was not unreasonable for liberals to conclude that their energies might be spent in opposition rather than in fruitless collaboration with the government. In any case, it soon became clear that the liberal movement would be very brief. Only hours after the declaration of the October Manifesto, there was renewed fighting on the streets as the country became polarized between left and right. This violence was in many ways a foretaste of the conflicts of 1917. It showed that social divisions were already too far deep for a merely liberal settlement. On October 18th, the day the manifesto was proclaimed, some of the jubilant Moscow crowds resolved to march to the city's jail, the Butarika, to demonstrate for the immediate release of all political prisoners. The protest was passed off peacefully and 140 prisoners were released. But on their way back to the city center, the demonstrators were attacked by a large and well-armed mob carrying national flags and portraits of the Tsar. There was a similar clash outside the Tagnaga jail, where one of the prisoners who had just been released, the Bolshevik activist N.E. Bauman, was beaten to death. For the extreme rightists, this was to be the start of a street war against the revolutionaries. Several rightist groups had been established since the start of 1905. There was the Russian Monarchist Party, established by V.A. Gringmut, the reactionary editor of Moscow News, and in February, which called for the restoration of a strong autocracy, martial law, dictatorship, and the suppression of Jews, who it claimed were the main instigators of all the disorders. Then there were the Russian Assembly, led by Prince Golitsyn, and made up mainly of right-wing civil servants and officers in St. Petersburg, which opposed the introduction of Western parliamentary institutions and espoused the old formula of autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality. But by far the most important was the Union of Russian People, which was established in October by two minor government officials, A.I. Dubrovnin and V.M. Perchnievsky, as a movement to mobilize the masses against the forces of the left. It was an early Russian version of fascist movement, anti-liberal, anti-socialist, and above all anti-Semitic. It spoke of the restoration of popular autocracy, which it believed had existed before Russia was taken over by Jews and intellectuals. The Tsar and his supporters at the court, who shared this fantasy, patronized the Union, as did several churchmen, including Father John of Kronstadt, a close friend of the royal family, Bishop Hermogden, and monk Eliodor. Nicholas himself wore the Union's badge and wished its leaders total success in their efforts to unify the loyal Russians behind autocracy. Acting on the Tsar's instructions, the Ministry of the Interior financed its newspapers and secretly channeled its arms to it. The Union itself was appalled, however, by what it saw as the Tsar's own weakness and his feeble failure to suppress the left. It resolved to do this for him by forming paramilitary groups and confronting the revolutionaries in the streets. The Black Hundreds, as the Democrats called them, marched with patriotic banners, icons, crosses, portraits of the Tsar, knives, knuckle dusters in their pockets, and by the end of 1906 there were 1,000 branches of the Union, with a combined total of up to 300,000 members. As with the fascist movements of interwar Europe, most of their support came from those embittered lumpen elements who had either lost or were afraid of losing their petty status in the social hierarchy. As a result of modernization and reform, uprooted peasants forced into towns by casual laborers, small shopkeepers, artisans squeezed by competition from big business, low-ranking officials and policemen, and the threat to those whose power of the new democratic institutions ranked, pub patriots, all kind disturbed by the upstart of workers, students, and Jews challenging the God-given power of the Tsar. Fighting Revolution Street was their way of revenging themselves, a means of putting the clock back and restoring the social and racial hierarchy. Their gangs were also joined by common criminals, thousands of who had been released under the October amnesty, who saw in them an opportunity for looting and violence. Often encouraged by the police, the Black Hundred marched through the streets, beating up anyone they suspected of democratic sympathies. Sometimes they forced their victims to kneel in homage before a portrait of the Tsar or dragged them into churches and made them kiss the imperial flag. The worst violence was reserved for the Jews. There were 690 documented pogroms, with over 3,000 reported murders during the 2 weeks following the declaration of the October Manifesto. The rightist group played a leading role in the pogroms by inciting the crowd against the Jews or planning them from the start. The worst pogrom took place in Odessa, where 800 Jews were murdered, 5,000 wounded, and more than 100,000 made homeless. An official investigation ordered by Witt revealed that the police had not only organized, armed, and supplied the crowds with vodka, but had helped it root out the Jews from their hiding places and taking part in the killings. The police headquarters in St. Petersburg had its own secret printing press, which distributed thousands of pamphlets accusing the Jews of trying to ruin Russia and call upon the people to tear them to pieces and kill them. Trepov, the virtual dictator of the country, had personally edited the pamphlets. Duranov, the Minister of the Interior, subsidized them to the tune of 70,000 rubles. But when Witt called for prosecution of the chief police responsible, the Tsar intervened to protect him. Nicholas was evidently pleased with the pogroms. He agreed with the anti-Semites that the revolution was largely the work of the Jews, and naively regarded the pogroms as a justified revenge by his loyal subjects. He made this clear in a letter to his mother on October 27th. Quote, "My dearest Mama, I'll begin by saying that the whole situation is better as it was a week ago. In the first 2 days of the manifesto, the subversive elements raised their heads, but a strong reaction set in quickly, and a whole mass of loyal people suddenly made their power felt. The result was obvious, and what one would expect in our country. The imperatives of the socialists and revolutionaries had angered the people once more, because 9/10 of the troublemakers are Jews. The people's whole anger turned against them. That's how the pogroms happened. It was amazing how they took place simultaneously in all the towns of Russia and Siberia. Cases as far apart as Tomsk, Simferopol, Tver, and Odessa show clearly what an infuriated mob can do. They surrounded the houses where the revolutionaries had taken refuge, set fire to them, and killed everybody trying to escape. What was emerging was the start of the counter-revolution, which would culminate in the Civil War. From this point on, anti-Semitism became one of the principal weapons used by the court and its supporters to rally the loyal people behind them in their struggle against the revolution and the emerging liberal order. For the revolutionaries, Bauman's murder was a powerful reminder of the regime's bloody habits. Overnight, the Bolshevik became a martyr of the revolution. Later, under the Soviet regime, his name would be given to streets, schools, factories, and even a whole district of Moscow. But in fact, Bauman was quite unworthy of such honors. He was fond of practical jokes, and on one occasion had been so malicious to sensitive party comrade, drawing a cruel cartoon of her as the Virgin Mary with a baby in her womb and a question mark and who the baby looked like, and she was driven to hang herself.